Hi everyone, my name is Davis Vaughn. I'm a software engineer at RStudio. Hopefully you've been reading my blog post on using VS Code to debug C and C++ code that's found in an R package. We're going to quickly look at a real example in rlang of where just a couple of days ago I used a VS Code to debug an issue with env binding ractive. And we're going to look at we're going to step through exactly how I used VS Code to kind of solve the problem, looking into the C code that powers this function. So Miles opened an issue on GitHub that stated that he was having some issues with env binding ractive, and the fact that it was kind of triggering active bindings, which is kind of the opposite of what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to just check if the bindings are in an environment, are active bindings or not, and just return a simple true or false per binding that it's checking for. So in this case, he had this function f, and he wanted to make this thing an active binding, where the idea was that if you called Fred, the active binding he made, with no arguments, in theory, it should just return get, should print out get if you called it with no arguments. And if you called the active binding Fred with an argument, it would be passed through as v here, and it would set the value of x with whatever you pass through as v. So that was the idea behind this active binding. So he set it in the global environment, and then he just used this rlang-env binding ractive function to check if there was an active binding in the global environment called Fred. It should just return true. It actually returns a named logical vector here, where the names are the names of the binding that you're checking for. So it does return true. We get what we expect, but it actively triggers the binding twice in the process, which is typically not what we want. So he opened an issue, and I actually solved this problem already and closed it and merged it into master yesterday, but we're going to actually walk through and use both RStudio and VS Code to help figure out what's actually going on here. So I'm going to bring over RStudio here, and we're going to take a look at the problem. Now I've used the gert package to go ahead and check out a branch that was using a hash before the fix was actually merged into rlang. So this is using a development version of rlang right before the fix was actually merged in. So that's already been run. So we can load up this development version of rlang, and then I'm going to bind, rather than his function, I'm going to do just something a little bit simpler, but more kind of loud. I'm going to bind a function to foo, where that function just calls stop, and it immediately errors. So if you were to say, here, give me foo, the active binding, it immediately errors with oh no. So in theory, with env binding ractive, you're just checking if foo is an active binding or not. So it shouldn't error. It should just give us a logical true or false. But as you see, you get oh no, which means that foo is being triggered while we're checking if it's an active binding or not. So the first way that I kind of typically look at these kind of things is, well, I don't have a good guess as to what the problem is, so I will typically debug once the function and kind of step through it a little bit. Let's see, so this is env binding rtype, so it's calling that function. And then env binding rtype looks like it's doing most of the work here. It checks that env is an environment. It validates some names. It calls env binding types. Oh, and this seems to be where the problem is. So let's try that one more time. And step into env binding our types, which is getting env and names, env binding our types, calls straight into some C code, foreign function interface or FFI, env binding types, calling these two things. Next, oh no. So at this point, if you don't have access to a C debugger, you're kind of stuck at reading the source code. We can go find FFI env binding types. Let's see what that is. It is mapped to a C function called rlang binding types. And this is what rlang binding types looks like. So we can read this code and we can try and maybe do some early exits or some printfs type stuff to see if we can figure out where that stop is actually being called from. Or we can use VS Code to help us instead and allow us to kind of walk through this line by line and hopefully figure out the line where the actual problem is. That's what we're going to do today. Before I move that, so to use VS Code, if you've been reading the blog post, you know that you need to set up a .vs code folder with launch JSON and kind of some properties JSON files, along with a tools directory that has a debug file in it that's going to be called. Now, at the bottom of the blog post, you'll see that I've got this use VS Code debug helper function kind of already set up, which basically sets up those directories for us. So we can just run this function. It basically wraps some use this functions to kind of write out some files. It goes ahead and sets up the VS Code and tools directories for you. We can go look at those. In the tools directory is now this debug function. It cleans, it loads, and then it just does a simple 1+1. So we're going to replace this with our problem code. Okay. And now we're going to move over to VS Code. So here's VS Code. We're going to open rlang. And you can see that the VS Code folder that was created before, this is the defaults that come with the use this like helper in the blog post. We actually don't need this CPP11 include. We really just care about having the basic R headers here for rlang. Rlang is a C package, so it's going to be using the information from the C99 standard field here. And then we're going to be using the launch configuration, which is going to launch R, and it's going to source that debug file that we just put our information in. So we learned that the function that we care about is called rlang binding types. Rlang binding types. So if we can navigate to that. Yes. So I don't really have an idea of where the problem is, so I'm just going to put a breakpoint on the first line here. So hopefully VS Code is going to break right as we enter rlang binding types when it gets called. So I'm going to run in debug, which is going to run that debug.r file for us and hopefully stop here. Now, one other thing that I'll say before I run this is that in the makevars file, which I opened with, use this edit r makevars to open this file, I've already set my C flags, which are important for rlang. It's C, not C++. C flags to 0 and G to get all of the compilation, or all of the debugging information. Otherwise, you'll end up with variables that just get optimized out. So let's launch this and see what we get. Source debug.r was run. It compiled the R package. It ran the lines of code that kind of trigger our env binding types to be run. And now we've gotten dropped right in to our env binding types. We can take a look around. So var env is an environment. We can actually kind of print it out if we want to with extra rf print value env, which says, yes, you know, that's an environment, nothing's fancy here. We can also print out the bindings variable that got passed through, which shows us that, yes, it was foo. So now we can start to kind of step through this code and hopefully we'll figure out what the problem is. It checks again internally that it expected an environment. Now it's going to switch over the type of bindings. We know that this is a character vector here, so symbols is going to equal false. And now we're going to call detect special binding. I'm not entirely sure what that does yet, but we'll see if it runs. Oh, and it doesn't run. That's actually maybe where the problem is. So this is where we get, oh no. Let's try that again. Actually, let's jump straight into detect special binding, and we'll break here instead, since we know that's where the problem is. Okay, so it gets the length of the bindings that we're checking for and starts to iterate through them. It converts our binding to a symbol potentially. Let's see what exprsim looks like. Print value. Looks like foo, a symbol. And then it calls which env binding, which seems to be where the problem is. So one layer deeper. Here's which env binding. We'll try one more time. All right, dropped into which env binding. And the first thing it does is check if the binding is a promise. Then it checks if the binding is an active binding. And then otherwise, it's just a typical value binding. Nothing special. It's not a special binding type. And that's actually where it errored. So it actually seems like checking if the value is a promise, which uses rlang-find, is actually where the problem is. And we'll do it maybe one more time. So here we're checking if the foo sim is in the environment. We're finding that symbol in the environment and extracting out the object that belongs to that symbol. And again, yep, that's where the problem is. So I've actually looked into this already, and rlang-find, if we navigate to that, maybe, rlang-find calls this base R function in the base RC API called find var in frame 3. And I've looked into it, and find var in frame 3 has a feature, not a bug, that it will actually trigger active bindings and return the value of the active binding back to you. That is a feature. So what this means is that our env binding is promise is pretty much working as expected. We're checking to see if that binding is in there. We're getting the value out, and we're checking to see, like, is that a promise? Yes. If yes, then return true. Otherwise, return false. And it shouldn't necessarily have to care about whether the thing was an active binding or not. To check if something is an active binding, we have r-binding, and it's active. This is another function in the R API that's exported. And this one is guaranteed to not actually trigger active bindings. So the fix is actually pretty simple here. All we need to do is switch the order of these two around. In my real commit, I also added a comment saying why the order actually matters here, because checking if it's a promise will trigger the active bindings. So we have to check for an active binding first. And then I also added a test. But let's see if this works now that we've switched around the order of these things. At this point, I've also removed all the breakpoints. So that ran and exited without any issues at all. Now let's check kind of interactively that it did what we wanted. So I've just navigated to that debug.r file. We'll clean and load the development version of rlang here. Now that we've added that fix, create an environment. Now remember, env foo triggers the issue, but just calling env binding r active with our patch now just returns foo true. It doesn't actually stop at all, so it seems like we fixed the issue.